Thank you very much for this very high-level and interesting discussion. Please allow me to make one comment and one question from the French perspective. And for us, it's clear that security and strengthening our security partnerships in the region is key. But our region also needs a positive agenda and a narrative for the future of this regional order that include some green initiatives, because climate change may destabilize our societies. This agenda needs also to be blue, because the scarcity of sea resources and the disappearance of marine biodiversity may cause social, political, and geopolitical problems. And it should also be about multilateralism and regionalism. And here, let us be clear, we have a few countries that want to duplicate the UN-centered multilateral system, and other countries that want to block the UN-centered multilateral system. And we will strengthen the rule of law in our region and the stability only if we play, strengthen, and reform the UN-centered regional system. So that was one of the ideas that President Macron is proposing, and he's now doing an important trip in the southern part of the ocean, the Indian Ocean. And yesterday there was an economic regional forum where the Indian government participated in La Réunion plant. And this is a few suggestions to help enrich and complement the concept of Indo-Pacific. My question is now, do you think that does India think that environmental challenges should also be part of its own Indo-Pacific strategy? Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you. Sir, here in the front, please. Here in the front, second row, please.
All these maritime aspects started with China enunciating the maritime Silk Route of the 21st century. I was invited by the government to do the first talk on the subject. I sent you the paper yesterday. I suggest we start looking at this as to how East Asia and China looks at it. That's my comment. Second comment, and a difference on what we've been calling the string of pearls. 2 years ago, there was an article of mine, String of Pearls, a millstone down China's neck. Gwadar. There is no way the Chinese can convert Gwadar into a military base. The entire corridor links to oil and flows of goods and material. They don't want to jeopardize it. Similarly, the other ports, India can knock them out in 30 minutes if something starts. So it's the economic aspect, and we should put down the security aspects, which has been highlighted in most papers. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ambassador Prakash, here on the first row, please.
Thanks, Chair. Very quick questions to the panelists. One, Quad. Dhruva, you mentioned Quad, and I see a strong linkage between Quad and the Indo-Pacific concept. Now, if you can, how do you see Quad evolving from your point of view, and the other countries which you think are natural candidates? Secondly, Russia. I would still request, if possible, for you to elaborate on how can Russia play a bigger role, because that's our official position, and especially in the context of the strong ties between Russia and China. Thank you.
Good. We'll take a few more, okay? Dhruva, I think we can then choose, and so we do one full round. I think Professor Mooney here, Aditya, here in the first row.
Thank you. Thank you for a very good paper. Two very brief comments. One is regarding the contours of Indo-Pacific. Ambassador Chinoy mentioned the American definition. The Indian definition starts with the western coast of Africa. Does it include Pakistan? Because I have seen any number of official statements, latest being by Jaishankar himself in Maldives. Pakistan doesn't figure in anywhere whenever India is discussing Indo-Pacific. So what it is in this kind of a definition. Secondly, I mean, that's truly emphasized the centrality of Indian Ocean in India's narratives on Indo-Pacific. And as you know that India's narrative is now almost being officially defined. After Prime Minister Modi, Foreign Minister Jaishankar has had two places. One is in Russia, given a very elaborate statement on that. And there is a very, very clear emphasis on the Indian Ocean. Now, if it is Indian Ocean for India as a primacy, how come we are so wedded to Indo-Pacific? Because then one of the key components of Indo-Pacific is the Quad. And we have now elevated this forum to a ministerial level, which gives it a political and strategic weightage. So where do we stand in relation to these things if Indian Ocean is the only emphasis?
Thank you, Professor. General Chopra here in the first row, please.
Mehta.
General Mehta, sorry.
He's
Sorry.
the traditional question asker. Thank you very much. Actually, central to this discussion today has been the securitization of the Indo-Pacific. And I'd like to present a clarification that this push for securitization is coming primarily from the United States. At the Raisina dialogue in 2016, Admiral Harris in Taj Palace said, and this was addressed to the Indian Navy, that why don't we do joint patrolling? And subsequently, the Chief of Naval Staff, the previous Sunil Lanba, made a statement that we do not do joint patrolling with anybody. We only do coordinated patrolling with our maritime neighbors. That's the first. And the second statement that Admiral Sunil Lamba made was that this Indo-Pacific is not a military construct. And therefore, is this strategic ambiguity which has been injected into the Indo-Pacific deliberate or accidental?
Thank you, sir. I think someone there in the back. Sir, yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm speaking here as a northern voice in this discussion about where we go eastward. When I listened to the discussion today, as you've been talking, I came away with a sense that we're setting a very modest agenda and a very narrow perspective on what India can achieve or will want to achieve in the Asia that we're talking about. Because the reality is that Asia is becoming the new center of the world. India has aspirations to be a major actor in that world. And so I think we have to, as we develop our thinking, not worry about what Mr. Trump or even his successor thinks, but what the people of the region want and what the countries of the region want. And I think that's going to be a very, very important component to put into our thinking.
Thank you. Someone in the back, please.
Thank you. I think that here many things the voice from China, and I think that you see when you discuss about the issues relating to the Indo-Pacific, and you talk much about China, and I'm very surprised and not surprised. It should be very wisdom to see that, because it shows that China have much more influence here. And when you talk about the Indo-Pacific or some other issues around the world, and you know that there's no China is impossible. And the second one, I think I should say that now when you talk about the Indo-Pacific, and you should know that how to see the role of China, and China ignores the challenge. I know from this book that there's
let's say that the challenge of China's rising. I don't think that the China's rise is a challenge. And the issue that it just provide more opportunity to all the area. And so for all the countries in the area, we should know that for a country like China, it's rising just get more, maybe it give more opportunities for other countries to get Indo-Pacific and the thematic area. And so if we all countries just think like this, and we maybe have a much more good future.
Thank you. Good. I think we have a great set of questions, comments, maybe 2 minutes each for some remarks. Dhruva, we'll start with you and then the other panelists.
I'll be very quick and I'll take 6 questions here very quickly. One, on environmental issues, I'll point you to 3 things. One, the MEA statement of 2017 on the Belt and Road Initiative highlighted environmental and local environmental and ecological concerns as an integral element of what good connectivity projects should look like. So you see it front and center in an Indian official document, official statement. You also see sustainable fishing and sustainable resource extraction very much front and center of India Sagar approach as well. So even in the maritime sphere, and this does have security implications, and France is trying to deal with this in Madagascar Straits. This is quite clear. Finally, on cooperation with China as well, one element I think of a successful cooperation with China is on climate change. So I think in all of these areas you do see environmental and sustainability issues front and center in India's engagement in the Indo-Pacific. Second, on the string of pearls, how many people here would have guessed that China's first overseas base was going to be in Djibouti 10 years ago? I'm not sure many people successfully would have predicted that. So we can all talk about how that, things won't get securitized, but after that has happened, I'm not sure many countries are willing to take a risk in believing that future potential dual-use port facilities cannot be securitized. And I think to the extent that we can have greater transparency, I would give the Chittagong port in Bangladesh as an example of that, where they've been particularly transparent. It would be helpful in mitigating some of the security concerns in countries. And just on the side, I would just contest this notion that for some reason America cares more about the security of the Indian Ocean than India does, which seems to be the undercurrent for a lot of these discussions. India has security concerns that are very much India's. And the fact that we are starting to see, I would actually point you to Sunil Lamba's speech, was it last year at Raisina, where he very explicitly spoke about these dynamics that I've written about and I spoke about today as impinging directly on India's maritime security interests. So I don't think India is doing this at the behest of America. This is some old Cold War thinking. I think India's doing what it's doing in India's self-interest, and we need to realize that. On Russia, I think the best thing to do is to engage Russia as much as possible. There's been, my understanding is Russian officials and certainly experts that I've engaged with are very resistant to the nomenclature of the Indo-Pacific, but to the extent that they can understand what is happening and understand Indian perspectives and be sensitized to it, I think it would be in India's interests. On the Quad is not the Indo-Pacific. I think that's very clear. And insofar as I mentioned it in the paper, it is one of many groupings that are evolving in the region. I think equating this is a very dangerous and very short-sighted approach. It is one of many different, and in fact there's a chart in the report that shows all the different groupings that India is involved with in the region. The Quad is one of them, but it is so far a foreign ministry-led grouping. It has come up with a certain specific agenda, which we saw in the readouts from the last meeting. I don't think necessarily it's useful to think of other countries joining the Quad, but in terms of other parties to engage with, I think France is one, several Southeast Asian countries. However, it depends upon them, and in many cases, at least on the security front, the Southeast Asian countries have been unwilling to participate in many of these groupings, these minilateral groupings, because they don't want to seem to be moving away from ASEAN unity. So, we can talk all about, let's invite Philippines and Vietnam and Indonesia. Many times they don't want to actually participate. So, I think it is incumbent upon them. Pakistan in the Indo-Pacific. Yes and no. So, I think, what we're seeing possibly evolving in Gwadar will have implications for the Indo-Pacific, obviously. But at the same time, for India, the India-Pakistan dynamic has a character of its own, separate from again, the larger dynamics I've described. And for that reason, amongst other things, we see Pakistan excluded from some regional groups such as IORA. So I think from an Indian perspective, I would say what happens in Pakistan may have implications for the Indo-Pacific, but it is also independent of the dynamics of the Indo-Pacific. Finally, on the question on China,
but just on Indian Ocean region, Professor Moon, should India focus, it came up, on the Indian Ocean region only and foremostly?
No, I think obviously the priority is on the Indian Ocean, and I think that is quite clear. But I think if we were to believe that what happens in the South China Sea does not affect Indian interests, what happens, I think, to a lesser degree in Northeast Asia and the South Pacific does not impinge on Indian interests, I think that would also be rather short-sighted.
It's not the issue. If it impinges on our interests, what is it which we are going to do?
Right. So I mean, I have described, I think, to some extent, some of the things that India is doing in these regions. I mean, amongst other things, taking a more active role in the South China Sea.
It goes beyond Indian Ocean.
Yes.
I emphasize only on the priority of Indian Ocean once we have accepted the Indo-Pacific.
No, I think, look, every country will have its own strengths, and in India's case, it will be determined by geography. And I think, obviously, when we look at the Indo-Pacific from India, the Indian Ocean is obviously priority number one, the Indian Ocean region. The South, and that's the map I showed. So the Straits of Malacca to the Straits of Taiwan are obviously a secondary region where India does have the capabilities and interests. And then I think you have tertiary regions such as East China Sea, Sea of Japan, South Pacific, where India can at best play a marginal role. So, but I do think a sense of hierarchy is perhaps in order. On China, the idea that China is not a challenge, I think if we were to look at what's happening on the boundary dispute, the fact that we have one, the fact that India believes the Belt and Road Initiative is a strategic project that is undermining Indian regional security and actually adding to security competition in the region, the fact that Indian companies are denied market access in China, the fact that China is blocking India's entry into the UN Security Council and the Nuclear Suppliers Group. I think if these were to change, I think certainly you could make a very strong argument that China is more of an opportunity than a challenge. But until that point, I think you would, the shift, the balance is in a different direction. I think it is in collective self-interest of all the countries in the Indo-Pacific, and I heard this repeatedly wherever I went, that a China that is more transparent, more market-oriented, more status quo-oriented, more norm-abiding would actually be welcomed by all the countries. But I think there are reasons, and I detailed them in this report, why we should be skeptical of that approach for now.
Thank you, Dhruva. Closing remarks for all three panelists, the message that you have.
So I feel that China has greatly overreacted to the concept of the Quad and the concept of the Indo-Pacific. And I think it is a sovereign right of any country, India and others, to engage in any kind of bilateral, trilateral, minilateral, plurilateral discourses, dialogues and engagement and cooperation. That having been said, it's also very clear that the Chinese believe that the concept of the Indo-Pacific and more particularly the Quad is some kind of a sinister plot that is being hatched in order to undermine its future. And now the key point here is that in the Indian Ocean, I think China's growing capabilities are quite clear. But it's also a fact that China's current presence, and I'm not referring to some distant past in which Cheng He made 7 voyages, one of which came and touched Hambantota. I'm talking about here and now. It's a new presence. Any new presence is obviously a disruptor. And therefore, along with capabilities, it's very important to have transparent intentions. And transparency in intentions means that you have consultations and you obviously engage people before you execute any kind of a flotilla parade or a nuclear submarine coming up on so-called anti-piracy operations and having OTR in Sri Lanka, etc. So this part I think is food for thought for people in Beijing. I'll go back to my earlier suggestion. Since the Quad is much maligned, it's important to think out of the box. Otherwise, we'll be boxed in this sort of construct that it is these four democracies that must forge a new compact. On the other hand, we keep saying that as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned, it must be inclusive and it must be transparent and ASEAN centrality, etc. So to get there, to make it more inclusive, to make it more acceptable, it is important to invite, for a start, perhaps in the Quad as well, countries like the Philippines, Vietnam and Indonesia as dialogue partners. You can even stretch the Malabar, which is currently between the United States, India and Japan. It does not include Australia. Alongside that, we are already bumping up our bilateral partnership with Australia by doing more on the maritime and military front, including India's participation in Kakadu or, for instance, Pitch Black and other exercises. But that's a separate question. The Malabar can possibly be in two parts. Part 1, which will have the 3 countries as they stand. Part 2 can be with the invitation extended to Singapore, that was part of the 2007 so-called Quad Maritime. So they could come in again on a one-off invitation. So could the Philippines, so could Vietnam, so could anybody else. So we can think of these new constructs also, and it's very important not to get confused by the term rules of the road. I sometimes look at this term rules of the road and wonder whose rules of the road, because there is obviously an academic dispute over rules of the road there. Rules of the road to me in legal terms straight away conjures up the image also of UNCLOS. When I look at UNCLOS, I find that there is disparity there, that some of us who speak of the rules of the road are members of UNCLOS and signatories. Some of us who speak of rules of the road are not members or signatories to UNCLOS. So how do we handle that, you know? And it's also very important to understand, for instance, FONOPS. Now FONOPS being conducted in the South China Sea, now Australia joining in, occasionally the Brits saying they'll step in. But if you look at 2017 and the conduct of FONOPS by the United States of America, US conducted FONOPS against 10 countries in 2017, and that actually includes the Philippines, Vietnam, India, Indonesia. The list is long, of course, China too. But the point I'm making is that, so therefore, what do you make of FONOPS? I mean, this is something that is something that's complex for those who are not directly involved in the quadrilateral, ministerial, or official level dialogue. It's a bit like the Buddhist parable of the blind men and the elephant, because all of them are, feeling the elephant, and they're blind and they're describing it as something that they choose to. So what kind of clarity we wish to bring to this conceptually, this is very important. What is inclusive? When we say inclusive, not just we, India, the Americans are saying inclusive, the Australians are saying inclusive, then what is inclusive? If you say rules of the road, then let's get down to the brass tacks. What is rules of the road?
Thank you. General Narasimhan?
I have just only one point to make. This is a concept that is evolving. So till the time it stabilizes, all these dialogues are going to happen. What is inclusive, what is free, what is open, whole lot of dialogues are going to happen. I think we need to wait it out a little bit to see how this concept stabilizes and then take it from there.
Thank you, General. Ritika?
I actually want to bring the conversation back a little bit to India, or end the conversation, right, with India and its domestic capacities, to say all the conversation about participating, partnering with like-minded countries or other democracies, it will boil down to what India can put on the table actionably. And that manufacturing capacities, its lines of credit program, for instance, there have been some changes in the rules of the road when it comes to lines of credit recently in the past year and a half, and actually showing proof of concept. You mentioned the Chittagong port, for instance. So, I mean, there are examples, but there hasn't been one case study that we can actually say that this is India's alternative or another option for these countries in the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you, Ritika. 3 thanks to all of you as we close this panel. Slightly late, 10 minutes. To you all joining us. to Dhruva for presenting this paper to us,
Very
and
good paper.
to the 3 panelists who kindly agreed to make time to join us here today. Thank you.